Today we're talking about data analysis. So I put together this short little presentation on how to do data analysis in a nutshell and get it done in a reasonable amount of time. The topics we're covering today is the ladder of inference, water high leverage questions, a data collection document, a frequency response process, doing your item analysis, and then having a data discussion with your colleague. What comes to mind when we think about data analysis? I'm going to give you just a second or two to think about that. I'm sure most of us are thinking about numbers. Some of us are also thinking about a time commitment. Sometimes maybe it's a little bit of a rabbit hole that you just kind of go down and you don't really end up with any results at the end of the discussion. And that's one of the things that we need to make sure we work on as educators and teachers is that we come to a conclusion with our data. It doesn't have to be profound. It just means we need to have a conclusion. Hey, this is what we learned from our data. Here's what we're going to do. Keep it simple. One of the big ideas I like to share with people is the ladder of inference. And here it is right here on the right-hand side. You'll see the different steps. But simply, when we're going to use this for data analysis for school assessments, we talk about high leverage questions. What are those questions that we thought the students should have known? And how did they do on those questions? We evaluate the item analysis, comparing how different students did on each question. And then we draw conclusions. And like I said, that's the big deal with this. We want to definitely just want to say, hey, I think that this happened, or my students didn't learn this. And then again, this is what I'm going to do next. We're going to plan that necessary support for our students. Now I'm going to explain a little bit more about high leverage questions. And so as we know, not all questions on a quiz or a test are created equal. And some of those questions mean a lot more to us when we're looking at the analysis on how our students did than others. And so something to think about here is those high leverage questions are something you thought they should have known. Like, hey, I taught this during class and these kids should have gotten this right. And then you look at how maybe they made those mistakes. Are they skills needed for the next chapter? Are we in a math class where we're teaching something that they're going to need in the very next chapter? Are we reading something in our English class and we're talking about setting? And I know that that's going to be a big deal going forward. Maybe it's something that's going to be very important on a test coming up for the students. And then we also look at what are they going to need to know next year. We cover an awful lot in our classes and we know our standards are very broad. And those high leverage questions are the skills that those students need to have to be successful next year. And then one of the other things I would say is a need to know or nice to know. I always think about sometimes with like a biology class, like we talk about maybe mitosis or meiosis. And we know that our students must know that coming out of intermediate school to be successful in high school. These are just things that we are not a nice to know, but they're a must know. And maybe it's something you think about. Oh man, my teacher back in the 9th grade made sure that I knew this in my math class or knew this in my science class or in my English class. And so that's what a need to know question is, something that's just very important for the student to be successful in the future. Here's a document that's just kind of your standard data analysis document. It has a place to put down who you're talking with, what's the data source, but then it breaks it into a couple of different parts. We have the steps right here on the very top. We want to select 5 high leverage questions. We want to review the item analysis for those questions, and we want to discuss the following items that we see here below. And so these are the steps that we're going to follow. We should make sure it only takes 20 or 30 minutes max to get through this. Again, we look at the data, we put out there what we think and how they did, and then we determine our next steps. And that's the most important thing. If we gave a test and we're not going to look at the data and we're not going to plan any next steps, why did you give the test? You wanted to learn what they knew and what they didn't know, but you really didn't think like what they didn't know really wasn't that important. So you're just moving on. And that's a failure for us as educators. We want to make sure we look at it. Are there gaps in their learning that are must know questions or must know strategies or must know skills? That's what we have to make sure that we cover. Here's a simple little frequency response where we sorted our questions from the most missed questions at the top to the very best questions on the bottom. And so look at the questions and we sort them to lowest to highest. We're going to use the test tool booklet and frequency response at the same time. So if you have those items, maybe you use a different data system than what I'm showing you here. You want to use a test booklet and the frequency response chart at the same time. If you're online, and just like this system here, which are Illuminate Education, you're just going to click on the number and it actually brings up the question and it brings up the frequency response, so you know what questions each student answered. Do we see any patterns or trends? That's something that we're going to be looking at when we're doing this analysis. Common standards of struggle, something that we're going to need to make sure we review. Question types or questions that are a challenge. Sometimes they're just tricky ways of asking questions. We all know that. We've all experienced that. Here today, we're going to look at question 12, which I have determined is a high leverage question. I chose item 12 for our error analysis and using it as our high leverage question. If we look at the question, we specifically see that it is a slope intercept question that I know students are going to see in the 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade algebra, probably going to see it in geometry, and they're going to certainly see something that looks an awful lot like it when they're in algebra 2. So here's a question that they should be able to do, and if they don't know how to do it, we definitely need to spend the time to help and make sure that they can become successful at this question. Here's the question. Take a look at it for just a second. I'll read it out loud. A motor car race is 500 miles long and consists of completing laps of a circular speedway that has a circumference of 2.5 miles. For which of these functions does y represent the number of miles a motor car has left to go in the race if x represents the number of laps completed by a motor car? Take just a second, look at that. You have 4 choices, and we can all see down right on the very bottom that B is the correct answer, and then it gives you some rationale for the other questions. When I put up the frequency response at the top, we see that 12 students answered A, 110, chose the right question B, but yet 51 chose C and 76 chose D. Look down here on the bottom for under the rationale, right down here. Look at those and let's think about what errors those students may have made when they were doing this question and taking a look at it. And this is the real meat and this is the real win when you're doing data analysis, to actually look at that, look at the error analysis and see what mistakes are our students making and how am I going to fix this in my students to help them go forward? How am I going to re-explain, reteach this again? What do they need? There's a couple of things that definitely come to mind when I take a look at this. I look at one, you do have the negative slope, which is always tricky. And then also you have a 500 as a y-intercept. And I know from teaching math and being in many classrooms over the years, having a y-intercept of 500 is probably a little bit confusing. As we all know, when we're doing sloped intercept questions, that having a y-intercept of 500 and students just trying to figure out the whole scale of things, that's going to be kind of tricky. Now looking at our data analysis collection tool and thinking about that slope intercept question that we just came from, what are we going to write down about student performance on this question? What did we see as a distractor or the question type? What was confusing for them? And then the most important step is, how am I going to reteach this? And you see on the example here, are we going to do it as a bell ringer one of the days over the next week or two in class? Are we going to do a full class reteach and go over it? Am I going to do a small group reteach? Because maybe it's just like 10 kids that really got it wrong in one period and I don't need to teach the whole class, but I do want to go over it with a small group. And as we all know, sometimes when we are doing the full class reteach, the students who really need it might not be paying attention. So doing a small group during class is probably a pretty good idea. Or maybe it's something short term after school, some sort of an intervention or an extended learning opportunity, ELO, that's the term that we use on here. And so these are all ideas, and this is really where the rubber hits the road in your classroom, how we're going to make it right. Our students struggled with this, and what are we going to do? What's going to be our next step to reteach? Thank you very much for following along. Hope you're having a great school year. Keep on being awesome teachers.